My brother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your father lives under our roof for free. He either signs over his savings to help with this house, or he finds somewhere else to go." Then he smiled, like he'd just said something reasonable. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there in his kitchen, holding a mug of coffee I no longer wanted, thinking about how my father had spent 38 years teaching high school English in Sudbury, Ontario. 38 years grading essays, showing up early, staying late. A man who used to mark papers at the kitchen table after dinner while my mother cleaned up, who drove 2 hours in February snowstorms to watch my hockey games, who never once asked for anything from anyone. And now Derek Holt, 41 years old, mortgage broker, my sister's husband of 6 years, was sitting across from me telling me my father needed to pay to exist in a room he didn't even want to be in. I need to back up. My father, Gary Lachance, turned 68 last March. He retired from teaching at 64 after my mother passed away from a stroke. Her name was Paulette, and she and my father had been together since they were 19 years old. They met at Laurentian University at a party neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, fell in love over bad punch and a shared disdain for the music, and spent the next 45 years building a life in Northern Ontario. They raised 2 kids, my sister Claire and me. They paid off their house on Regent Street. They had a small joint savings account they called the retirement cushion, which they built up slowly and carefully over decades. $196,000 when my mother died. My father was not a man who talked about money. He didn't brag about what he had, but he also didn't pretend he had less than he did. He lived simply. He drove a 2017 Ford Escape with 200,000 kilometers on it and considered that perfectly fine. He made his own coffee every morning, bought his groceries at no frills, and donated $200 a month to the food bank because my mother had always done that and he wanted to keep doing it in her name. After she died, the house on Regent Street became very quiet. Too quiet, I think. My father told me once that the worst part wasn't the grief, it was the sounds. The absence of all the small sounds she used to make. The kettle, her slippers on the hardwood, the radio she kept on low while she cooked. He said the house was so quiet some mornings that he could hear the furnace cycling on and off from the bedroom. He stayed there for about 8 months after the funeral. He kept up the place, shoveled the driveway, kept the garden from going completely wild. But I could tell when I called him that something was shifting. He wasn't depressed, exactly. He was just adrift. Claire called me in February of that year. She lives in Barrie with Derek and their 2 kids, Emma and Jackson, and she had a proposal. She said she and Derek had talked it over, and they wanted Dad to move in with them. They had a finished basement with a separate entrance. Not a full apartment, but a bedroom and a small sitting room and his own bathroom. She said it would be good for Dad and good for the kids to have their grandpa around. She sounded genuinely enthusiastic. I remember thinking how generous it seemed. I asked if she wanted me to talk to Dad about it. She said she already had and that he was considering it. She wanted my take. I'll be honest with you, I had some hesitation. Not about Claire. Claire is my sister and I love her, but about Derek. I'd never had a falling out with Derek, but I'd also never quite trusted him. He was the kind of man who was always calculating something, who framed every conversation as a negotiation without you ever quite realizing it. He had an easy smile and a habit of making jokes at other people's expense and calling it banter. My mother used to say, very quietly, that Derek thought very highly of himself for someone who had accomplished what he'd accomplished. She wasn't a cruel woman. That was about as sharp as she ever got. But Claire loved him, and their marriage seemed solid, and I didn't have a concrete reason to say no. So when my father asked what I thought, I said it could work if he was comfortable with it. He sold the house on Regent Street in April. It went for $388,000. This was the Northern Ontario market, not Toronto, so that number felt significant in Sudbury. He'd paid it off years ago, so that was $388,000 coming directly to him. After fees and a small amount of remaining property tax he owed, he netted $374,500. He moved into Claire and Derek's basement on a Saturday in late April. My brother-in-law rented a pickup truck and we moved boxes all day. Derek carried things and made jokes and seemed perfectly fine. My father seemed nervous but okay. We had dinner together that night. Claire made a roast chicken, and it felt almost normal. I want to be clear about what my father contributed in that house, because it will matter later. He paid $900 a month to Claire and Derek for what they called rent, though there was no formal agreement in writing. He bought his own groceries, except that he often bought extra for the family and left things in the main kitchen without comment. A flat of eggs here, a bag of apples there, a case of sparkling water the kids liked. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He replaced a cracked tile in the main bathroom, recalked the bathtub, built a small raised garden bed in the backyard with Emma one weekend, and planted tomatoes. He picked the kids up from school 2 days a week so Claire and Derek didn't have to leave work early. He was not a freeloader. He was not a burden. He was a 68-year-old man trying very hard to fit quietly into someone else's life. About 4 months in, Claire mentioned that she and Derek were thinking about finishing the rest of the basement to add another room. She mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you want the other person to bring up again later. I didn't think much of it. Then my father called me one evening in October. It was a Thursday, I remember, because I had just gotten home from a work dinner, and I was still in my coat when the phone rang. He sounded careful, that's the word I'd use. Like he was picking which words to use. He said Derek had sat down with him the previous weekend and had a conversation. Derek had explained that the house was expensive to maintain, that the mortgage had gone up with the rate increases, that they were feeling stretched thin. He had presented it in a very organized way, my father said. He had actual numbers. He said the household cost more than $6,500 a month to run, and that the $900 my father contributed wasn't really covering his share. Then Derek had said what he had to say. He suggested that my father contribute $80,000 from his savings to help them pay down the mortgage. He framed it as an investment in the family. He said it would allow them to lower the payments, create more stability, and that eventually, he used the word eventually, the family would benefit from the equity. He also suggested that my father's name could potentially be added to the deed at some later point, though nothing specific was offered in writing or in any concrete timeline. My father told me he had not said yes or no. He said he told Derek he wanted to think about it. I put my coat back on after we hung up and went for a walk. It was October in Ontario, which meant it was cold and dark by 7 o'clock, and I walked around the block twice trying to figure out if I was misreading the situation. I tried to be generous. Maybe Derek genuinely was struggling financially. Maybe this was an awkward but well-meaning proposal. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. My father had sold his house, a house he had lived in for over 30 years, a house that held 45 years of his marriage, to move in and be close to family. He paid monthly. He gave time, labor, presence. He had $196,000 in savings that he and my mother had built together over a lifetime of modest living. And now his son-in-law was asking him to hand over nearly half of it to pay down a mortgage that was not his, for a property that was not his, in exchange for nothing in writing, and an eventual that meant absolutely nothing. I called Claire the next morning. I asked her directly if she knew about this conversation. She said yes, and that she thought it was a fair discussion to have. She sounded uncomfortable but not apologetic. She said the house was expensive and Dad had money he wasn't using and it made sense for everyone. I asked her if Dad's name was going to be on the deed. She said Derek was looking into it. I said that wasn't an answer. She said I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. I drove to Barrie that weekend. My father and I had coffee in his sitting room in the basement on a Saturday morning, while I could hear Derek upstairs watching hockey. I asked my father what he was thinking. He said he didn't want to cause problems. He said Claire and Derek had been good to him, and he didn't want to be ungrateful. He said maybe Derek was right, that he wasn't contributing enough. I want to pause here because this is the part that made me the angriest, though I didn't show it in front of him. My father felt guilty. This man, who had raised 2 kids on a teacher's salary, who had shoveled his daughter's driveway the entire previous winter, who drove her children to school twice a week, who had given up his home to be close to family, was sitting in a basement bedroom feeling like he wasn't doing enough. That is what this conversation had done to him. I told him clearly that $900 a month was rent. It was payment. It was enough. I told him his time with the grandkids had value. I told him no amount of money he gave Derek would ever result in his name being on that deed. I said that as calmly as I could, but I meant every word. He looked at his coffee cup for a long moment and said, I know. That's when I knew he'd already decided deep down. He just needed someone to confirm what he already felt. Derek came downstairs about an hour later. He poured himself a coffee from the machine my father had bought and put in the sitting room, sat down like it was his basement. Well, it was his basement technically, and asked how things were going. His tone was pleasant, that calculated pleasantness of someone who believes they hold all the cards. He brought it up himself after about 10 minutes of small talk. He said he thought it would be good for the 3 of us to talk together. He said he understood my father might have some reservations and he wanted to clear them up. I let him talk. He went through his numbers again. He explained the rate increases, the carrying costs, the future equity. He used the words family investment 3 times. He did not mention any timeline for adding my father's name to anything. Then he looked at me and said, "Your father lives under our roof for free. He either contributes in a real way or eventually we're going to have to rethink the arrangement." I noticed he'd changed the number. In the conversation with my father, it had been $80,000. Now he was saying contribute in a real way, which was vaguer and somehow worse. I asked him what rethink the arrangement meant. He shrugged, like it was obvious, and said that they might need the space for other purposes down the line, that the current setup wasn't sustainable. I asked him what Dad would receive in writing if he gave them the money. He said they'd work something out. I asked when. He said these things take time. I looked at my father, who was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who had been patient about something for far too long. Then I looked back at Derek and I said, "I think my father should start looking at other options." Derek blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected the conversation to go the way his conversations usually went, pleasantly, with everyone adjusting around him. He said that wasn't necessary, that he was just having an honest financial conversation. I said I understood and that my father would be in touch. We drove around Barrie that afternoon, my father and I. He was quiet for the first while. Then he said, "I don't want to be somewhere I'm not wanted." I said, "Then let's find somewhere you are." I want to be honest. Finding a place was not instantaneous. It took about 6 weeks. My father was not in a rush and I didn't want him to panic buy something that wasn't right. He had the money from the Regent Street sale, $374,500, plus his $196,000 in savings, plus a monthly pension from the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan of just over $3,800 a month. He was not financially desperate. He had options. I helped him look at condos in Barrie and in Orillia, because he wanted to stay close to Emma and Jackson even after everything. That mattered to him. He wasn't punishing Claire and Derek by leaving. He was just protecting himself. He found a 2-bedroom condo in Orillia, about 40 minutes from Barrie, 2nd floor south-facing, with a balcony that looked out over Couchiching Beach Park. It was listed at $399,000, and he paid $404,000 after a small bidding situation. He put $250,000 down and took out a small mortgage he could comfortably cover with his pension. The condo was his name and only his name on the title. He moved out on a Saturday in early December. Claire was home. Derek was not. He'd made himself conveniently scarce for the day. Emma cried a little when she hugged my father goodbye. She was 9 years old and had spent several months gardening with him and doing puzzles in his sitting room, and she didn't fully understand why he was leaving. My father held it together for her. He hugged her and said he was just getting his own place and that she could come visit whenever she wanted, and he'd let her pick which bedroom to use. He gave Claire a hug at the door. She didn't say much. She looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words that would make it okay. He carried almost nothing out of that basement that wasn't his to begin with. I helped him set up the condo that weekend. We assembled a bed frame, hung curtains, stocked the kitchen. On Sunday morning, we had breakfast at the table by his balcony door with the coffee he'd bought at the Orillia Costco and the light coming in from across the park. He seemed lighter than I had seen him in months. Not happy exactly. There was still grief there for my mother, for the house on Regent Street, maybe even a little for Claire, for what he'd hoped that arrangement would be. But lighter. He said, "I should have done this sooner." I said, "You did it when you were ready." He nodded and looked out at the water. 22 days after he moved out, Derek called him. My father told me about it afterward, and I asked him to walk me through the whole conversation so I understood it correctly. Derek's tone had apparently shifted considerably from the confident man sitting in the basement with his coffee. He said things hadn't been going great since Dad left. He said the kids missed him, which was true. He said Claire missed him, which was probably also true. He said the arrangement had been working better than Derek had realized. Then he circled around to what he actually meant. The 2 school pickups a week that my father had been doing, the things around the house, the constant presence of a responsible adult who was just there. He said maybe they'd been too hasty. He said perhaps my father might want to come back and they could come to a new agreement. My father said he thanked Derek for calling. Then my father said his place was working out very well and he thought he'd stay. Derek apparently said something about the door being open. My father said he appreciated that and wished them well. He told me Derek sounded like he'd been expecting a different answer. After Derek, Claire called. That conversation was longer and harder. Claire is my sister, and she and my father have a real relationship that Derek's scheme had strained but not broken. My father listened to her for a long time. He told her he loved her and that he wasn't angry. He told her he wanted to see the kids and that she should bring them to Aurelia whenever she wanted, and he'd take them to the park and they could go to the pancake house down the road. He said he hoped she and Derek worked things out in their own house. What he didn't say was that he was coming back, and Claire, who knows our father, understood that. Emma and Jackson came to visit for a weekend in January. My father had bought a small air mattress for the second bedroom, and they made a fort with the blankets. He took them to the Aurelia waterfront, bundled up in their snowsuits, and Emma apparently told him the fort was the best sleeping situation she'd ever had in her life, which my father repeated to me with obvious pleasure. He FaceTimes me on Sunday evenings now. He is learning to cook things he never cooked when my mother was alive. Nothing fancy, he's a practical man, but he told me last month he'd successfully made her lentil soup from her recipe card and that it had tasted almost right. He seemed very pleased about almost. His name is on the deed of a home that is entirely his. His savings are exactly where he and my mother put them, except now they're in a GIC at a credit union in Aurelia, earning him a reliable return. He spent 38 years teaching other people's children how to think carefully, to question what they're told, to know the difference between a good argument and a persuasive one. He learned all of those things himself a long time ago. He just needed a moment in a cold basement in Barrie to remember that he knew them. He didn't raise his voice once, he didn't ask for anything back. He just quietly gathered himself and left and built something that was only his. That, as far as I can tell, is the whole story. And my father is doing just fine.